Miss James, I'm single.
Miss James, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a bartender. I'm also a musician, but primarily a bartender.
And how long have you been bartending?
Oh dear. Well, I was in school for a while, in college, and I dropped out because I figured with my talent, I could make money a number of ways. And well, I went to a bar, and people there just seem to enjoy my voice better. I think they have better taste. And so I started bartending.
Now, before we talk about the night of the accident, I want to talk some more about Mr. Dawson. How do you know Mr. Dawson?
Well, he comes in the bar every now and then, and we played on the same softball team.
And so let's talk about how he acts in the bar. How does he act?
Oh, he's a real gentleman. He's nice to everyone. He's a big flirt, buys everybody drinks. Even tries to get me drinks sometimes on the job. And I told him, now, Danny, you know better.
And to your knowledge, how does he usually get home?
Well, you see, there's something really unique about Danny. He's real conscientious. He doesn't drink and drive.
Objection, Your Honor. Neglect of personal knowledge.
Your Honor, this is the bartender working at Chuggy's. She has seen the defendant many times in the course of her work, and she is able to give personal knowledge about how Mr. Dawson gets home.
May be heard, Your Honor. The witness's testimony was that Danny does not drink and drive. While she may have observed him sometimes at Chuggy's, she's not with Danny at all times, nor has she seen him every time at Chuggy's, or we have not heard testimony to that effect. Therefore, she cannot say for certain that Danny Dawson does not drink and drive.
So is that a motion to strike then that testimony?
If sustained, yes, Your Honor.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to strike that testimony, but I'm going to allow you to develop further foundation. Okay.
Miss James, do you see Mr. Dawson around the bar a lot?
Oh, yes. And every time he's there, he's real conscientious about the things he does.
And does he have a reputation around the bar?
Like I said, he's a swell guy, a real sweetheart. Handles himself very well.
And so, to your knowledge, how do you see him get home?
Well, every time I've seen him, I'm leaving the bar and closing up. It's around 8. He's coming back on a cab, taking his car home.
All right. Now that we know what Mr. Dawson acts like at the bar, let's talk about how he acts outside the bar. What's he like playing softball?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
Your Honor, the fact that he plays for the softball team, and we can expect the witness will say his athletic ability on the softball team is not very good. Knowing this makes the fact that he failed the sobriety test more likely because of his athletic ability.
I'll allow it.
Miss James, what is Mr. Dawson like on the softball team?
Well, I like Danny and all, but he's real awful. He'll get up and he'll try to hit the ball and swing and go in a full circle and fall flat on his face. Boy, it's so clumsy.
How do the other members of the softball team view Mr. Dawson?
Just the same. I mean, we keep him on because he's real nice, but not a very good player.
And so, do you guys ever have any jokes of Mr. Dawson at his expense?
Oh yeah, there's this running joke that if Danny got a
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
Your Honor, this is an exception to hearsay under Rule 803.21. This is the reputation held by members of the community, in this case, the softball team.
May be heard, Your Honor. There's no foundation that the softball team comprises a community under the rule of law or even Midland's rules of evidence. It's merely a group of friends that he hangs out with, not a general community, as, say, Midland's town would be.
Well, I think I'm going to err on the side of being inclusive rather than exclusive. I'm going to go with the suggestion.
Miss James, does the softball team have any running jokes?
Oh, we do. We used to say that Danny would fail a field sobriety test, even stone cold sober. He's so uncoordinated. He's just no way I thought he could pass one.
And so, do you guys ever test it out?
Yeah, we have an officer on the team, Dirk. He's giving him a field sobriety test, and it didn't look like he was doing too good.
And so, according to what you saw, it didn't look like Mr. Dawson did too good.
No, I thought he failed. It was just awful.
Now let's talk about the actual night of the accident. When did you first see Mr. Dawson?
Well, Daddy came in the afternoon, saw me, and I hadn't seen him in a while, so I was happy to see him. But he was looking kind of blue, talking about an interview. I tried to cheer him up.
What happened next?
Well, he was there, we talked for a while, and then his friends came and they moved to go see the band.
And so, anything about his behavior? How was he acting that night?
He was just being Danny, buying drinks for everybody, being nice to everybody, real flirt and schmooze.
So just to be sure, you've seen Mr. Dawson buy drinks for other people.
Oh yeah, I mean, of the drinks he purchased that night,
Mr. Dawson got home that night?
I don't. But, I mean, it would be just so unnatural for Danny to have been drinking and drank too much and drive. I cannot imagine that he would do that.
Thank you, Ms. James. Pass the witness.
Thank you, Counsel. Ross?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed? Ms. James, you've been a bartender at Chuggy's for about 2 years now.
I have.
And you found in your experience with patrons that the drunker they are, the more they tend to tip you.
Well, they like my music better. Like I said, they have better taste in bars, and they like my music more and they tip me more.
Ms. James, to redirect you to my question, you find that when patrons are more drunk, they tend to tip better.
Well, they like my music better, and then they tip me more. Yes.
Ms. James, a simple yes or no. When patrons are more drunk, they tend to tip you better, correct?
Well, yes, they drink more, they like my music, and they tip me more.
So you're grateful that Chuggy's doesn't make you measure how much alcohol you put in each drink.
Well, I feel like I'm responsible, so I'm very grateful that they allow me to have responsibility.
Ms. James, you're grateful because this allows you to put more alcohol in each drink you pour.
Well, sir, I would never spike anybody's drink.
Ms. James, you're grateful that the bar does not make you measure your shots because it allows you to put more alcohol in your drinks, correct?
No, that's just not true.
Well, Ms. James, Danny Dawson's one of your regular customers.
Yeah, he comes to the bar.
Ms. James, over the past 2 years, he's tipped you about $2,000.
I would say around that much. You're good at math.
And in order to, so that you can repay him for these tips, you put more alcohol in his drinks.
Well, I never heard of someone repaying someone for tips.
Ms. James, since you're grateful for his tips, you put more alcohol in Mr. Dawson's drinks, correct?
Sir, I'm sorry, I do not know what you're getting at.
Ms. Dawson, yes or no? You put more alcohol in Danny Dawson's drinks at the bar because he likes him that way, correct?
Well, are you asking me how Danny likes his drinks, or if I put more alcohol in them?
Ms. Dawson, yes or no? You put more alcohol in Danny Dawson's drinks because he likes them that way, correct?
Well, I make the drinks the way he likes them.
And that is strong, correct?
Not necessarily, no.
Now, Ms. James, you made a sworn statement in this case,
I did.
and you were given 24 hours to update it with any relevant information.
I believe they told me that.
And you swore to be truthful, accurate, and complete.
Yes.
Let the record reflect that. Should I opposing counsel witness this statement? Permission to approach the witness.
Yes.
Ms. James, I'm handing you your witness statement. Can you look and see your signature on the last page?
Yes.
Now, can I take that from you? Now, if I could direct you to line 34. Danny would rather drink one drink that has a liquor or two than be hassled with having to drink 2 drinks. Did I read that correctly?
You did?
Now, moving on. You're familiar with how the bar keeps receipts, correct?
Yes, I
So you help make the receipts during the night with the patrons' bar tabs,
am. Yes, I do.
and you were present when Mr. Dawson signed his bar tab that night.
Yeah, I was the one that handed it to him.
And when the police came to get Mr. Dawson's receipt from the night in question, it was you that provided them for the police.
Oh, yeah, it was me.
Let the record reflect, I'm not showing opposing counsel was in previously marked as states 2 and 3, the receipts from Chuck's. Permission to approach the witness. James, you recognize these documents.
I do.
And are those the Danny Dawson's bar receipts from the night of September 24th and 25th of 2010?
They are.
And are they fair and accurate copies in all respects?
Well, yeah, this is what he bought.
At this time, the state prosecution moves exhibits 2 and 3 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Permission to approach and attend to the bench.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Ms. James, at the end of the night, Danny approached you to sign his bar tab.
He did.
And he said to you, thank you for pouring them long and strong, correct?
Yeah, Danny said that.
And then after that, he said that he'd be home in record time.
No, he didn't say that to me.
So, Ms. James, he then left the bar, correct?
Yeah, Danny left the bar.
Right, nothing further this time.
No, Your Honor, we ask the witness step down.
You're excused. Thank you. Next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Ashley Norton.
Dr. Norton.
Morning, Dr. Norton.
Morning.
Would you introduce yourself to the jury?
Yes, my name is Dr. Ashley Norton.
What are you here to talk to us about today, Doctor?
I was asked to take a look at the breathalyzer that was performed on Mr. Dawson the night after he got into that pretty bad accident to determine whether or not the results were valid.
Before we get into that, I have to ask you, how are you qualified to assess the validity of breathalyzer results?
Well, I got my bachelor's in science from Brown University in chemistry, and then I got my master's and my PhD in forensic science from Johns Hopkins University. I'm a professor of medicine here at Midland State. I'm also the president of the board of American Toxicology. I've been working with breathalyzer machines since I got my master's.
Why is it necessary to review the validity of the results of a breathalyzer sometimes?
While these machines are really helpful, really wonderful tools, they're not perfect. They make mistakes. Mainly they have trouble telling the difference between certain types of alcohol. The alcohol we refer to as bar alcohol and body alcohol.
Now, are you familiar with the Intoxilyzer 8000, the model that was used on Mr. Dawson that night?
Yes, sir, I'm a trained operator and evaluator of that model.
So, when you're evaluating the results of a breathalyzer, what kind of information do you need to do that?
Well, I need the results of that breathalyzer, and then I need to speak with the subject, in this case, Mr. Dawson, get a timeline of what they ate and drank on the night the test was performed.
Did you have all of that information in this case?
I did. The state was very forthcoming with their information, and I was able to interview Mr. Dawson.
And was there anything else that you needed?
No, sir.
With that information, what do you do with it to reach your conclusions?
Well, I set the results aside for a moment and used a formula that was invented by basically the creator of my field, and worked backwards from what the subject has told me, based on how many drinks they consumed over a certain amount of time, with various variables taken into effect. I can determine what their blood alcohol concentration was when the test was performed.
Dr. Norton, I want to talk a little bit more about the Intoxilyzer 8000, the model that was used on Mr. Dawson. What kind of events can cause that test to maybe not be perfectly accurate?
Well, like I said, these machines are useful, but not perfect. The main problem that we see is that the machine can't tell the difference between the alcohol that you go during, say, a glass of wine or beer, and the alcohol that's naturally produced in the human body.
Dr. Norton, you're talking about the alcohol that's naturally produced in the human body. Now, does that alcohol make you intoxicated?
No. Believe it or not, there's a lot of human body functions that produce alcohol. Pathways for enzymes, digestion, other events. And what that causes is just alcohol that the machine reads. It doesn't affect your judgment, it doesn't make you tipsy like a couple glasses of wine.
Why is it that the Intoxilyzer 8000 can't tell the difference between body alcohol and bar alcohol?
Well, if you think about it this way, if you stand on a scale, basically to weigh yourself, and you hold two 20-ton weights in your hand, the scale's going to say that you're 40 pounds heavier than you are. It can't tell the difference between your body proper and the two 20-ton weights you're holding in your hand. We see the same problem with the Intoxilyzer and most breathalyzer models. It reads the bar alcohol, the body alcohol as the same.
Dr. Norton, what can cause body alcohol?
Like I said, a lot of normal functions in the human body. The biggest culprit that we see affecting these breathalyzer tests, however, is something that we refer to as mouth alcohol. It can be caused by breath mints, mouthwash, dental work, vomiting, acid reflux, burping, things like that.
Do we have any reason to believe that Mr. Dawson had any mouth alcohol at the time that he was given his Intoxilyzer 8000 test?
Yes, sir. I believe Mr. Dawson was suffering from heartburn, which is one of the symptoms of acid reflux and can cause mouth alcohol. And I believe it did in Mr. Dawson's case.
What makes you say that?
Mr. Dawson told me when I spoke with him that he had a large cheeseburger, coleslaw, and extra large order of cheese fries. And he gave him heartburn.
Dr. Norton, if Mr. Dawson had heartburn at the time that he was given his breathalyzer test, what would that have done to the results?
It would have elevated the results. Basically, it would have told the operator that Mr. Dawson's blood alcohol content was higher than it really was, because it would have read that body alcohol the same as the bar alcohol.
Dr. Norton, do you believe that the results of the breathalyzer test that Mr. Dawson was given that night are accurate?
No, sir.
I pass the witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Now,
Dr. Norton, you just told me and this jury that the Intoxilizer 8000 can't tell the difference between bar alcohol and body alcohol. Isn't that right?
That's right.
But isn't it true that the Intoxilizer 8000 actually does a fairly good job of screening out substances that are not bar alcohol?
That's true. The Intoxilizer 8000 does do a fairly good job, but it's not perfect.
All right then. You also talked about the possibility of mouth alcohol, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Now, you reviewed the records that were produced by Dr. Avery Smith, didn't you?
I believe I reviewed the breathalyzer report.
Right, so you've seen the results from the Intoxilizer
Yes, the
test,
printout,
right?
that's right.
So you know that it took 2 samples from Mr. Dawson, didn't it?
Yes, that's standard.
And you know that the Intoxilite and typically, if mouth alcohol were present, at least one of those samples would show a spike. Isn't that right?
Typically, but not always.
Now, neither one of those samples did show a spike, did it?
That's right. If there's enough mouth alcohol present, the machine won't register a spike.
And neither of the samples produced an error message, did it?
That's right.
And typically, that would have happened if mouth alcohol were present. Isn't that true?
Typically, but again, not always.
Now, you also told us that you were pretty sure that Danny Dawson had acid reflux on the night in question, right?
Yes.
And you came to that conclusion based on talking to the defendant. Isn't
That's
that
right.
right? But isn't it true that when you talked with Mr. Dawson, he couldn't remember whether he had acid reflux?
Mr. Dawson informed me he had heartburn based on what he ate. He informed me that he couldn't remember when exactly he had the heartburn, just that he had suffered from it.
But bringing back to my question, he couldn't remember whether he had burped or had acid reflux. Isn't that right?
In between the accident and when the test was performed, that's right.
So now that we've talked about your actual conclusions, let's talk about why you're here today. You were asked to testify by Mr. Dawson's lawyers, isn't that right?
Yes.
And they asked you to look for errors in the breath alcohol testing done by Dr. Smith, didn't they?
They asked me to evaluate the breathalyzer results.
It's your testimony today that they did not ask you to look for errors?
That goes with analyzing the validity of the results.
So they did ask you to look specifically for mistakes in the breath alcohol testing, didn't they?
Of course, I was to determine whether or not they were valid.
And for that work, they paid you $250 per hour, didn't they?
That's right.
So before you ever walked in the doors of this courtroom this morning, they had paid you $5,000, isn't that right?
That's right.
And in addition to that, they're paying you $2,000 for testifying in court today, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Now, despite the fact that you're being paid all that money, even you would admit that it is very likely that Danny Dawson's blood alcohol concentration was over 0.08. Isn't that right?
I can't determine specifically what Mr. Dawson's blood alcohol content was. I believe it was around 0.08. All I know is that it wasn't near as high as 0.19.
So that's a yes. You believe that it was around 0.08, right?
That's right.
Thank you. Nothing further from this witness this time.
Redirect.
No, Your Honor. We ask that this witness be allowed to step down.
Step down. Thank you for your testimony. Next witness.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to call Ms. Leslie Roman to the stand. Ms. Roman, would you please introduce yourself to the court?
My name is Leslie Roman.
Ms. Roman, what do you do?
I'm an accident reconstructionist. I own my own firm right here in Midlands.
And why are you here today?
I'm here because I was hired by the defense to reconstruct the accident that occurred on the night of September 24th, early morning of September 25th.
What is accident reconstruction?
Accident reconstruction is when you gather all of the facts that you have to determine what happened at an accident, as much as is scientifically possible given that we're not actually there at the time.
Now, what qualifications do you have to look at the scene?
Well, I have a degree in engineering from the University of Texas, and I'm also accredited by the governing body for accident reconstructionists, and I've been working in the field since 1993.
What kinds of information did you look at when you were coming to your conclusion?
I did several things. I went to the roadway myself where the accident occurred. I looked at the vehicle involved in the car accident. I looked at the fatal crash team report from Officer Foster. I looked at photographs, and I looked at affidavits as well.
And was the information you gathered, was it enough?
Yes, I had more than enough.
What did you do with the information once you had it?
Once I had the information, I used the principles of physics and the formulas that we have in the Windsor and Strasbourg primer. That's the article that has all of the physics formulas we use in our field. And I plugged those facts and data into my formulas to come up with my determinations.
And are these physics formulas used across your field?
Well, yes, all accident reconstructionists use the same article, the Windsor and Strasbourg article.
Did you reliably apply these principles methods to Mr. Dawson's case?
Of course, I wouldn't be here otherwise.
Now, let's talk about the conclusions you made. Well, when you made the conclusions, what was the first step you took?
The first thing I did was make a diagram of what happened in the accident. Since I couldn't actually be there, it's helpful to be able to visualize what exactly occurred.
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with their diagram?
Certainly.
Showing the opposing counsel. Your Honor, would you like a copy of the diagram?
It's always helpful to have a bench copy. Dennis, do you need this for your examination, counsel?
Oh no, we have a copy of the. Let the record reflect that I handed the witness for a copy of it. Ms. Roman, can you describe what's on that diagram?
Yes,
Objection, Your Honor. This document is not in evidence, and for Ms. Roman to describe what's on the document would not be proper.
So why don't you lay a bit of a foundation, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Roman, is this a true and correct, a fair and accurate depiction of the accident scene?
yes, of course. This represents exactly what happened.
At this time, I'd like to offer Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Your Honor, at this time we would object under Rule 407, subsequent remedial measures. If you look at the map that you're holding, Ms. Roman has marked where trees have been cut down after the accident. This is inadmissible as it goes to subsequent remedial measures taken by the state. Actions taken by the state after the accident are not admissible today in trial. And I ask that this piece of evidence not be published to the jury.
Your Honor, if we actually look at Rule 407, it specifically talks about certain times this evidence would not be allowed in court. It talks about when we're trying to prove negligence, culpable conduct, a defect in product, and various other specific instances if you look at that rule. We're not talking about any of those instances. This is a murder trial, not a civil trial that's talking about product liabilities and such. As such, 407 doesn't even apply in this case, and the evidence should be admitted.
Counsel, I take it this is being offered to, as Ms. Roman's, a depiction of Ms. Roman's reconstruction of what occurred at the accident, and the fact that the removal of trees isn't material to what she's presenting. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Objection to the
Your Honor, once again, I'd like to offer this piece of evidence into this Exhibit 13 into evidence in today's trial.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Admitted.
We'd also ask that you be allowed to utilize an enlarged version of this diagram for demonstrative purposes.
Your Honor, at this time we would object to this being shown to the jury. Your Honor has just stated that the trees being on the diagram is not relevant to Ms. Roman's testimony. The same diagram that's in front of you is going to be presented to the jury, and it's more prejudicial than probative for them to be able to see the subsequent remedial measures taken by the state.
I don't agree, counsel.
Your Honor, if that is the case, then may that be constructively redacted from the diagram when it is shown to the jury?
Your Honor, we'd like to say that, once again, 407 does not apply. And it is not more prejudicial than it is probative. It is extremely probative in that we know exactly what happened to the scene of the accident.
Don't you object to the redaction?
Yes, I do. I believe that it should not be redacted.
Why not?
I don't agree with the opposing counsel's grounds for the redaction.
But wouldn't it still serve your purpose even if it's redacted?
Yeah, I believe it would, but we'd like to allow the jury to see the full picture of what happened that time.
I'm going to admit it's subject to redaction.
Thank you.
Your Honor, at this time we ask that Ms. Roman be allowed to step off the stand in order to use the demonstrative.
No objection, Your Honor, but may I petition myself so I may also see the demonstrative?
Yeah, could we adjust that? A little bit?
Oh, I can
you
do it
step in?
myself.
Okay. Ms. Roman.
Okay, this is the demonstrative that I made. Can you see it? Closer? You're good? Okay, great.
Ms. Roman, now would you tell us what the diagram depicts?
Okay, so Mr. Dawson was traveling northbound on Canyon Road, coming from this direction, when he had to suddenly swerve. When he swerved, the right tires went off the side of the road right here.
Well, what happened after he went off the road?
Mr. Dawson, he was able to maintain control of the vehicle around this curve for 124 feet. Then he re-entered the roadway.
What happened next?
Well, when he got the car back onto the road, it was pouring rain, and the wheels, they couldn't get traction with the road. There's some water sitting between the roadway and the wheels, and the car began to spin out of control, as you can see here.
What happened after it spun out of control?
The car exited the roadway after spinning out of control and struck a utility pole and a tree.
Let's go back to the swerve. Ms. Roman, why did the car swerve initially?
Well, do you have a marker?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Okay, so there are two ways that you can look at an accident. You see, if you have the curve of a roadway, like this, you can either swerve off the road by going straight when the roadway curves, or you can swerve to avoid an object. The way Mr. Dawson swerved was consistent with avoiding a suddenly appearing object, like a deer or a falling
Objection, Your Honor.
branch.
This is based on hearsay. The only way the witness could have known that Mr. Dawson was swerving to avoid something such as a deer is through hearsay.
Your Honor, the witness is not saying that the deer was the object. She's saying that a suddenly appearing object was what caused the swerving. Not necessarily a deer, but a deer could have been the object, not necessarily was the object.
Your Honor, in that case, I would move to strike the example of the type of object and just ask that Ms. Roman be limited to saying that she was avoiding, that it's possible the defendant was avoiding an object.
Wasn't there testimony that he swerved to avoid a deer?
No, Your Honor, we have not heard any such testimony today.
Okay. Your model, Ms. Roman, is based on the assumption that Mr. Dawson swerved, correct?
Yes, Your Honor. I was able to determine from the officer's report that he had in fact swerved.
So why don't we just eliminate any reference to the deer, any reference to a deer will be stricken, and we just stop rendering something that we swerved. So
Yes, Your Honor.
your testimony, any reference to a deer is stricken, the testimony is that he swerved. Proceed.
Ms. Roman, can you just show us how he swerved once again?
Yes, so you see this swerve that goes around something? That's the way Mr. Dawson swerved. He actually exited the roadway at an angle. So rather than going straight when the roadway curved and failing to negotiate the curve, he had to swerve around something, some sort of object.
How would a person driving under the influence of alcohol have swerved?
Probably
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion. This witness has no qualifications to describe how someone who is intoxicated would have swerved. It's speculative.
Your Honor, this is an accident reconstructionist as well as a road safety specialist. She's analyzed various cases in which individuals have been driving. She looks at the road, tire tracks, and other such qualifications. She can testify as to how these individuals would be driving at the time. She can talk about how they generally drive.
Counsel, I haven't heard anything that convinced me that she has a background to distinguish between what a person does, a qualified or expert on how a person drives when they're under the influence of alcohol. Now, it may be that you can develop a further foundation if you want to, but I'm going to sustain the objection, subject to your right to have a further foundation if you want to drive.
Ms. Roman, you said something about taking certain courses that certified you in accident reconstruction.
Yes, that's right. I've taken a number of courses in a variety of different issues. Accidents can be caused by a number of different reasons. People texting, people drinking, weather conditions, and just plain bad driving sometimes.
What kind of information did you learn in this class in addition to what you just said?
Well, one thing that we learn generally is that in accident reconstruction, it's important to look at how the driver acts. The way the driver acts can tell you a lot about the driver. For instance, if a driver doesn't turn when they're going around a curve, they're likely impaired.
How would an individual under the influence of alcohol be impaired?
I'm not sure how alcohol affects your body and how many drinks do what, but what I do know is what happens to those swerve marks. If someone goes straight and does not exit the roadway at an angle, they fail to negotiate the curve. But that's not what happened in Mr. Dawson's case. Mr. Dawson swerved in this curving pattern to avoid an object and exited the roadway at an angle.
Now that we know about the swerving, let's go towards later on in that accident diagram, towards where he hits the utility pole in the tree.
Yes.
Could Mr. Dawson have taken any precautions to avoid the accident taking place?
I'm not so sure there's anything Mr. Dawson could have done, but there's a few things the city could have done. They actually...
Objection. At this point, I'm going to object to subsequent remedial measures under Rule 407. As Your Honor has already ruled, this is not admissible today.
Sustained.
Ms. Roman, you were saying that he couldn't have taken any precautions. Why so?
Well, I believe that the object that appeared in the roadway, it wasn't just sitting there waiting for Mr. Dawson. He came around this curve, and he would have to see it suddenly. He would have no choice but to swerve. Otherwise, he would have a certain accident and collide with whatever object was in the roadway.
How could the lighting and weather conditions have played a part in this accident?
Well, I'm sure, as you know, when you're driving at dark, driving in the dark, in the rain, it can be much more difficult to see and to maneuver a vehicle.
Pass the
Cross-examination, Your Honor. I ask that Ms. Roman be allowed to retake the stand. Counsel, please dismiss. Now, Ms. Roman, you were hired by the defense in today's case, isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And in fact, you're being paid $200 an hour for your time.
I am.
And you've so far worked for 25 hours on today's case.
Yes, I worked 25 hours before I came to trial, and then I also get paid separately for coming to trial.
So let's just break that down, Ms. Roman. So far you were paid $5,000 before you came to court today.
That's right, for my expert report and compilation.
And you're being paid $2,000 for your testimony here today.
No, that's not right.
You're being paid $2,000 to be here today, is that correct, Ms. Roman?
Yes, I'm being paid to come to court. It doesn't matter what I say, I get paid no matter what.
Now, Ms. Roman, on direct examination, you talked about Mr. Dawson's vehicle and the crash, isn't that correct?
Yes, exactly.
And when you were assessing the crash, you actually provided a speed, isn't that correct, that the defendant was going when he exited the roadway?
Yes, that's right. I believe that Mr. Dawson was traveling at 51 miles per hour.
And the way that you calculate the speed is by using something called the combined speed formula.
That's right. That's in that Windsor and Strasburg primer I was talking about earlier.
And the combined speed formula takes into account the various segments of a crash.
Exactly.
So the vehicle exiting the roadway would have been segment 1.
Yes, when he was driving partially on the grass.
And then the vehicle cutting across the roadway this way would have been segment 2.
Exactly.
And then the vehicle actually hitting the tree would have been segment 3. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
What would have been segment 3, Ms. Roman?
There is no segment 3. He has 2 parts of the travel, and then he hits the utility pole in the tree, and that's when we do the calculations.
And so you base these calculations on these 2 different segments, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And so part of your calculation is to calculate drag factor, isn't that correct?
Yes and no.
But Ms. Roman, drag factor is when tires come into contact